All right, we're live again. Welcome back to Microsoft 365 Virtual Marathon. This session is Azure Functions for Microsoft 365. Stephen Fowler is our wonderful speaker. Stephen, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Sorry for being just a little bit late. So in this session, what we want to talk about is really helping you as a solution provider really think about all of the different tools and things that you have available to you in Azure to help you build out your M365 and Office 365 based solutions. And a key piece to that is serverless. And so what we want to do is provide a little bit of a crash course of serverless for folks that are new to it. And then, of course, this is a developer collaboration conference, so we want to get into code. We really like that. So we're going to do that as well. So just a little bit about this. If you haven't already seen it, don't miss it. The big collaboration conference coming up. So make sure you attend. A little bit about myself. My name is Stephen Fowler. I am a Microsoft MVP in Azure as well. I had also got about a dozen or so years on SharePoint and Office 365 as well. I'm the managing partner of a consulting firm called Jivu. We're originally from the Boston area, and I live down in Atlanta. And let's go ahead and get started with the session. So let's talk a little bit about the evolution of how platforms have worked. If you've been working with SharePoint and M365 technologies for any time, we have moved past having code actually on the servers as full trust code and further physically and or logically isolating our solutions from the platform for scalability amongst other types of things. And Microsoft has really been helping and really push to stay out of the box with Office 365 and M365 technologies. So the key piece is historically, we had always worked with on-premises based solutions. But when we start to take a look at this, though, the problem really starts to come into how do I package my code content and configuration, who monitors it, who patches it, how does all of this really start to come together? And that's, of course, where Azure comes in when we start to talk about infrastructure as a service, where it starts to take on some of that responsibility in regards to the virtual machines and getting everything patched, like I said, and getting things pulled together. But you would still be responsible for packaging your code content and configuration and getting it to that infrastructure. So a lot of organizations mature towards going towards a PaaS-based solution where a lot of that has already started to be brought together for you, and then it's just a matter of making sure that you deploy your code to the right technology stack of runtimes, .NET, Node, those types of things. But at least from an operating system and whatnot, all of that's taken care for you. I would imagine as technologists, a lot of you are familiar with a lot of this, so we're kind of moving a little bit fast, and I want to be able to have enough time to get into taking a look at the code here. But when it comes to moving beyond PaaS and we start to take a look at serverless, we really need to start to figure out how do we architect our app? What is the right mix of technologies based off of what we're trying to accomplish? And the answer is it depends. What you have to do is get the functional and non-functional requirements of your solution and start to map it to the tools and the technologies. And what we as MVPs, as well as Microsoft, are really trying to create the reference architecture and design patterns by which when you have a certain level of technology in the mix, you know, how would you go about doing that? And also the human capital of who has the skills in order to tackle some of this, right? And so at the very core, if we go way back in time, was BizTalk, right? BizTalk was an integration piece, the glue that kind of got things together. And out of that team came WebJobs. WebJobs was a way of basically creating an API layer to allow things to connect. And then from that came Azure Functions. And Azure Functions is an abstraction of WebJobs and makes it so that you can literally just deploy a widget of code, a little packaged piece of code that does a very discrete process and does it very well, does it at scale, and will do it very inexpensively. Okay. What sits on top of functions is logic apps, and logic apps really start to bundle multiple process steps of a business process to do something within Azure or any other type of manipulation of content and data that you want. And it also has, of course, a big piece to this, adapters to third-party services. And so that you can really start to kind of extend this. Now, for those of you that are in the know, Power Automate, and I'm trying to get myself to say Power Automate because I had said Flow for so long, but Flow/Power Automate is an abstraction of Logic Apps, right? So Logic Apps sits underneath Power Automate and then functions underneath it in Web Jobs. So you can start to really see how the evolution of this abstraction of doing business process management. As it comes to picking out some of these, when we talk about the design patterns, again, it depends on how savvy the person is in using the tools and the technologies, your budget, the training, all of the associated costs for a total cost of ownership for the solution. Now, alongside of the logic apps is a really key piece here called the event grid. And the reason being is that with Azure Functions as well as Logic Apps, there are obviously events that need to trigger this code to fire off. So if you really think about it, there could be a whole bunch of different popular ways that that you could scale a widget of code that is pay as you go for those compute services. And that's really what we're talking about, the cost for the compute services to run any one piece of logic. There's a couple different things that come into play, especially if we start to talk about IoT devices and pulling IoT into SharePoint or data analytics into Office 365. You know, how can we do that very cheaply? Okay. But, you know, how do we manage all of these events, especially if they start to get into the millions of events? And so the event grid is one of those technologies that allows us, and it's like a messaging capability that would allow us to go ahead and do that. And Microsoft really is moving towards that concept that all modern applications are event-based, and that something like the event grid would be the ability to do that. So these are services that have technology that sit behind them. So functions, you would not necessarily have any type of state with them. They would be stateless. So if you wanted to maintain state, you would have to persist that back to either Azure Storage Table or a storage queue or blob storage or maybe Cognos DB or other types of things. Likewise, there are very inexpensive capabilities of Azure for doing analytics, full on AI machine learning, that you could have SharePoint or another Office 365 app pass some information off to a function or a logic app, and then go provide the best of breed services within Azure, and then return those results back to you in a way that then Office 365 almost just becomes your presentation layer. Okay. Of course, in order to do all of these, there are a number of technologies that are provided to you. One of the things that we're going to talk about when we jump into the code is how do we build infrastructure as code? So we have a repeatable process for packaging our solution and getting it promoted through our development cycles. How is it that we use Visual Studio Code and through the extensions to go ahead and manage these? How can we quickly pivot over to the Azure portal if we wanted to and take a look at things there? We're going to be talking a lot of that, about the IDE and the things that we're going to be doing to develop our functions. So what would be some of the common scenarios, do you think, for something like serverless? One would be something like real-time streaming processes, right? So you've got a bunch of IoT devices sending data that needs to be analyzed and then archived somewhere. But you ultimately have Office 365 as a SharePoint site or SharePoint lists or things like that. That would be the basis for peering into some of this content. Or maybe a SharePoint list is where you inventory specific configurations or runtime rule inputs for an Azure function to pick up and then go do things. There's a lot of work also being done, of course, in the community for provisioning of SharePoint sites or provisioning of Teams as well, and have that be done all through Azure Functions. And then if we take a look at timer-based processes, gosh, batch processing has been around since the dawn of time, right? And so there very well could be a scenario where you could go ahead and have a timer-based job fire off. Now, what's pretty cool, and I have this as one of the links of stuff that you can look into. Think about if you have a little bit of skills enough to create a console app as an EXE in Visual Studio, and you have just some rudimentary programming skills, you could actually put that that console application that you built, push the actual binary EXE out to OneDrive, and then you could actually have an Azure function interact with that console app. So that console app may take in some parameters, some input parameters, and then it reports back something, or it does some kind of file processing or whatever. So you could hook into one of those, and then your EXE becomes the payload for your Azure function, which is pretty slick. So if you got some legacy data or some legacy systems like that, you could go ahead and do it. Of course, we would have a lot of backends for mobile. Once again, IoT is a big kind of popular thing. Different types of use cases for this type of serverless architecture. And in this diagram, if you look right here, you can actually see a mobile app sending an image to the function, which then stores it somewhere in an Azure storage. And then if you wanted to have a document library in Azure, up in SharePoint, you could do something like that as well. For instance, think of the scenario where you want to drop images into a SharePoint library and then have an Azure function fire off and process something, either, a sentiment of how the person's feeling, or different types of things, and then do metadata tagging in SharePoint, right? So you have the increased findability of your content. So you could have an Azure function whose sole job is to use the power of image processing AI to metadata tag your images in SharePoint. That would be another really kind of slick scenario. Okay. Then bots, right? I think there's other sessions that actually talk about how to do the bot framework, and there's a whole bunch of Azure functions that you could use to help work with some of that. So you can integrate bots, of course, into your SharePoint intranets and so on and so forth. So basically, what a function really is, if we really think about it, is the ability to build, test, and deploy a piece of code locally, and that's a key piece. We're going to show that to you on your machine and make sure everything's working good, and then you can then deploy that function out to Azure. Know that it will scale to the moon and be very, very inexpensive. And part of app modernization is really moving away from legacy application technology stacks to using stuff like Azure Functions because of the scalability and how inexpensive it is. And then there's a bunch of unique triggers, things that we can use, to go ahead and build these. We're going to take a look at that. And then they support a whole array of programming languages that you can work with, anywhere from C# to Node to Python to JavaScript. Those are all different languages that you can use. What I will show you really quickly, though, is that the templates that they have to rapidly scaffold your Azure function is going to be dependent on the software language that you choose. As you can imagine, C# has the most. It is equally has as many templates as JavaScript, but Python is a little bit lagging. But fortunately, Python, when you're doing it for your Anaconda or TensorFlow and all of the different type of analytics that you may want to do on your Office 365 data, there's enough templates there for you to get that done. And of course, continuous deployment. So what are some of the events that we have? So once again, we have webhooks, we have timer jobs, we have event grid, we have SMTP, we have email. There's a bunch of different things that trigger off the code in your Azure function, and then that output could likewise be a lot of those same results or to persist it. So I think you get the idea. We're not going to get into it today. There's a lot of documentation, and I don't want to slow us down in getting into any more detail than we have to on this. But when you start taking a look at the pricing, the scalability, and some of the limitations, there's a host of different levels that you can go to in regards to kind of using the free way of doing it, but being severely limited, all the way through SMB or small business scale deployments, all the way up to enterprise deployments. And this also works on the Azure stack, as you can imagine, and then we can work locally as well on any type of runtime functions. And then Azure functions are coming out to the edge. So if you have a microcontroller that's doing IoT, you could actually put an Azure function out there. So it goes beyond just M365. Okay, so let's go ahead and get coding. All right. So if you want, you can go ahead and shut off my my face here. And let's talk a little bit about the scenario. Well, first of all, let me go ahead and do this. I'm going to provide a link that's going to give you all of the dependencies that you need in order to get this to work. One of the things that you're going to want to do is install the Azure CLI. This will actually work within Windows or any type of operating system. This will allow you to package your functions as infrastructure as code, and then go ahead and just push things right through the command line. If you want to do bash shell scripting, which is a very common deployment model that I use, but we're going to do everything right through Visual Studio Code. So we're going to take a look at that. And then the other thing is, if you're going to go ahead and do an install, I would encourage you to have a script that actually does the install as well. And let me just make sure that this is nice and big so you can see it. Once you have Visual Studio Code installed, in order to leverage the ability to work with Azure Functions, there's primarily two things that you're going to want to do. You're going to want to do an npm install of the Azure Functions command line interface, the CLI, and then that will allow you to go ahead and issue CLI commands. And you can see here where I'm literally initting a new project. I'm just changing the directory into the project, and then I could go ahead and list out all the templates. So let's go ahead and take a look at that real quick, because that's kind of a key piece to this. So if I list out all of the templates that I have on my machine, you can see them here, okay? And they have them listed by software development language. So you can see all the ones for C# and JavaScript, and then of course, once you start getting past the Microsoft technology like Python, it gets a little bit smaller, okay? And then with those templates, you can scaffold very rapidly a project that basically, once you go into your project, you can literally just create a new function by simply saying what template you want to use and what name you want to call it, and then it will go ahead and create all of this for you in, and then of course the last thing that you probably would want to do is fire off the ability to open up Visual Studio Code in the actual project that you just created, okay? And this would be a repeatable process. So what would something like that look like? Let's go ahead and open up another project. And so this is essentially what you get. I went ahead and I created one that's just called HTTP function. And then within that, I created from the template one called HTTP trigger. and then it went ahead and scaffolded all of this out for me. And then I just slightly changed the implementation of my Azure function. And as you can see here, it's 16 lines of code with a lot of curly braces. And what it does is it's just taking in a webhook of allowing you to pass some information in. You can either do it through the JSON body of the HTTP request, or you can do it through the query string. Okay, either one of those two locations will basically just echo out what it is that you had sent in. Very rudimentary function, but at least gives you the warm and fuzzy that you've got all the dependencies on your environment working and life is good. The second thing beyond that function CLI that you need to have installed would be to have the functions extension. So I went ahead here and I put in a whole bunch of different extensions for Azure, but one of the one that is really key here is this Azure Functions. Okay, that's what's going to give you the IntelliSense and whatnot. So if we go back here, after we do the scaffolding of that project, and we go ahead and do a very simple implementation of this, what we can do is just hit F5 and it will go ahead and run the project as we would normally think. Now, it's kind of interesting what this does. If you notice, what it does is set up a shell environment to run your Azure function locally as if it were running out in Azure itself. And so if we were to have go back to this, that's why in the screen you just saw when I did function, it echoes out the command line interface. So that's what we just saw scrolling. And then there's different things that we can do through here to deploy this function, either locally to a Docker container if we wanted to, or use Kubernetes if you want to use containerization. It has all that ability. So if this is, if we're good to go, then we should be able to control click or just say follow link and go to our browser. And let me go ahead and just zoom this in. And here is our implementation. Now it's telling us that we have to pass something in as a good goober. And so let's just go ahead and do the query string and basically just say name equals Stephen Fowler. And there you go. We now served up via an Azure function the ability to take an input and echo it back. Now, I think you can understand that we could actually make this implementation to be all sorts of things, especially if it were Python and using some machine language code or Anaconda or whatnot. It could do a bunch of different analytics, but it's literally just a couple seconds to scaffold an Azure function, hit F5 and get it running locally. And now the barrier of entry rather is really low and you can focus on providing business value. Okay. So that's kind of our first piece. So let me go ahead and just stop this one here. And then let's go to another scenario. So another scenario we have is we're going to create a function. And this function is going to be a little more entailed. What we want to do is make it so that this Azure function takes two numbers and then adds them together and provides the results. Now that doesn't seem all that interesting, except for the way that we're doing this. We're going to make it so that Excel can leverage this Azure function to do some type of calculation, and that, well, I don't want to get ahead of myself. We'll talk a little bit about how you could extend this. So if we could go ahead and hit this and run this as well, and it's going to do the same thing as before, running off the Azure function, running it locally, doing all of the scaffolding. There's the logo that we are familiar with. And now I have this new Azure function running locally. I'm going to follow the link and it's going to say, please provide two numbers as input. So we're going to go ahead and say the first number is 3 and the second number equals 4. And so it did the multiplication for us. I don't want to have a complex financial modeling capability because I want us to focus on the implementation and not this whiz-bang thing that it's actually doing. You're going to see the power of this in a moment. So we know that we've got this secondary Azure function that does some math. Well, let's go ahead and pivot over and take a look at this other project. I have another custom function right here that is an Office 365 add-on. And this add-on will add capability to Excel and make it so that we have a custom Excel formula, our formula, that will do internally whatever we want it to do. Again, the implementation is very simple. We want it to simply be the addition. And here I just want to shut off my video here just so that it's not slowing things down. Okay. And that we could make this be some type of really cool financial modeling capability. So let's go ahead and get this running. And there's more things to it than just a function, because this is an implementation to actually make it so that there's a, once again, an Excel add-on with the capabilities. So we're going to see that working here in just a minute. So let's go ahead, and we're working off of that first add to. Later, we're going to promote it to use the Azure function up in Azure, but right now we're going to use it working locally. So let's go ahead and hit F5. Let me see if you don't mind your eyes bleeding just a little bit. I'm going to try to bump it down a little bit just so we got a lot here that we're, uh-oh, that wasn't good, but let's see. This should still work even though there was a pip thing. So there's a couple things. Let me go ahead and show you this. This actually fired off Node and is actually running this secondary function here and is tracing things out. The great thing about this is when you do a single line of code change, it's going to recycle this so that you always have the latest version of this code running on the fly. You don't have to start, stop. So in addition to this popping up, it fired off Excel. And within Excel, it fired off this custom plugin that we have. And now we have some custom, we have some custom formulas that we can now use that will be served up. So let me see if I can go ahead and split screen this between that and this, because I want you to see the requests coming in. So let's go and, okay, and let me just bump the screen down just a little bit because I want you to start to see this. So if we say $, and we say that we are going to use a Contoso add function and pass in, once again, our two parameters. Let's add 4 and let's add 4 to the number 5. We hit, it's saying busy. Hopefully this won't take too long. Right now, that first local function that we have is communicating with this function, should be doing the add, and then should come back and tell us the, should give us the answer. And I'm asking a whole lot of my computer streaming this and and having all of this working. So I probably should have tested to make sure that it worked over this. If it fails, it's going to come back with just the name busy. I'm sorry, value rather, similar to an out of the box one. I'm really waiting and hoping for this to show the numbers added up. While that's waiting, let me see if I can do another one. There's another custom function called clock. And what this does is, look at that. Some code in my function that adds a clock. I could also make a custom function, Contoso, that does an increment. Oop, and I got to pass in some values. and it wants to increment. What do I want to increment by? And then I can go ahead and say 5. And then I could say this equals that plus 10. Or let me do times 100. See, that equals that divided by that. So you can possibly think of some scenarios where you've developed an Excel-based solution and you want a custom function that on the fly is evaluating something and producing the results in an Excel model. And then all of your other financials start to real time on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, maybe not on a second basis like this, but you start to see the power of this. I really wish the ad would work here. And if you have any questions, just go ahead and we'll try to save it off to the end here. I want to try to get through some of this. Okay. So once again, this is all here, and there's going to be a GitHub repo for all of this as well. So, and I will go ahead and stop that. The other thing that you can do on these as well, because these are our node, you can do your standard node run build, node run start to get these to work. Okay, and let's go ahead and rerun that one. There you go. I just wanted you to see that you could actually get that working. I wanted to just try again, error installing functions. I just wanted to see, I really wanted to try to demo that, the ad, because what that is that's, one is just the counters and all of that, that's all within one function. I wanted to show you the add because I wanted to show you one function calling another function. And we've got a little bit of time here, so let's see if we can. So add, oops. Let's see if we can do 3, 2. See if we can get the answer 5. One of the things that you would expect on this is this right here, because it's up and running, will provide will provide the tracing on this. So for instance, if I were to go over to here and bring this tracing down, if I were to add the 2 numbers here, and the second Azure function is calling this one and doing it as first equals 2, comma, second equals 3. Saw this just jiggle. And then, oops, it would help if I didn't provide that. And I need an ampersand. So that's what I'm expecting to happen over here on this Excel, but it's just saying busy, it's not failing. So I hope it's not a performance thing here, but okay. Well, let's move forward. So now what we want to do is, yes, this all works great locally, but what happens if we want to, let's say, have this locally running function call this function, Azure function, but we want this Azure function to be up in Azure? How would we go about deploying that? Well, let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to minimize that one. We're going to open this one. The first thing you're going to want to do is install the Azure account extension, and then you're going to want to log into your Azure accounts so that you can start to see things. Okay. And then what you're going to want to do is, if you go out to the actual code that you have here, if you Control-Shift-P, and let me just make sure I have the other window open. And let me just close this. I just want to make sure that I can see if there's any comments coming through. Okay, super. So once we do a Control-P, and let me go ahead and stop this so that we can see this a little bit better. Control-Shift-P. you can start to say, well, I want to do something with Azure. What do I want to do with Azure? I want to work with Azure Functions. And then you can go ahead and connect. You can install those types of stuff. And if you look, though, once you use one, you'll see in the latest that you want to deploy an Azure function. Because I am logged in, the wizard's going to ask me where I want to deploy it to. So I would go ahead and say MVP. And then you can see that I created one earlier today, but we're going to create one with a slightly different name. And we're going to call this, let's call it M365 Virtual Marathon. That name has to be globally unique. Let me just show you that again, because this is going to hang off of a URL at Microsoft that has to be globally unique. Let's go ahead and keep it at EASE2. And you can see down here, it's provisioning. And this does take just a little while for it to create the resource group up in Azure. It's then going to create the Azure function. It's going to create a storage account for it. And then it also creates Azure Analytics so that you can see how many times it's hit, how performant, if you will, all the different metrics of how good your function's working. And then if we go over to here inside the functions, you can see that it's actually creating it. And you can see that I have one here as well. Now, there's a couple more configurations that we're going to need to do to get this to be able to work properly. So we'll wait for this one to be finished here. It should be finishing up 5:05. If you wanted to, the cool thing about this is if we went down into here, you can see where we've got our resource group. Let's just look at some of the assets that are being provisioned, and this should automatically get extended. So we have some app insights right here that get created by the same name. We have a storage account. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. Here's the storage account down here. I know I've got a lot of, let me close some of these. And we don't need virtual machines and we don't need Cosmo DB. So if you look, it has for the function the ability for us to store state off to blob storage or file storage, and we could reference queues if we wanted to, or tables, very low level capabilities of Azure to do state persistence that keeps your Azure consumption really low. That's what we like. And then let's see, this is still provisioning. Let's take a look at this other one that I provisioned earlier today. You'll see that there's the function, the storage account, the insights, and then this runs within an app service plan. So those are the 4 assets that get provisioned when you do this. And you can see here that it's deploying. Let's just, for the sake of time, show you a couple things. So it says that it's done. So let's go ahead and, since it's done, let's go down in here and then let's go here. If you say open in portal, which is a really quick way of basically jumping right to that resource, here we are inside of our Azure function. Okay, let me help you navigate around a little bit. This will tell you how many requests you have and its availability. These are some analytics that you have. There's additional ones available to you as well if you get into the app insights. But the other thing that we want to do, and let me just go up back to the resource group. Oop, there we go. That's a storage account. I want to go up to the, okay, there we go. So here's the app service plan. Here's the insight, storage, and the actual app service itself. You can have multiple functions in an app service, and I would encourage you to do that. So don't heavily brand this to be a discrete function, but have it be branded after a bundle of functions. Why? Because if you look down here, you actually have the list of the actual functions themselves. So I could have add to and other different ones that are listed here. If you go in here, you will actually see, be able to get what the function URL is, and it's right here. And this is the fully qualified name. And then let's go ahead and just open up a new browser and go to it. It looks like, and I was hoping that would show up a little bit larger. Hopefully you can make that out, but it's our name.azurewebsites.net. And then same as our code, we have it hanging off of API, so on and so forth. The other great thing is that when you're in here, you can actually test directly through Azure. So you could say, I want to go in here, I want to test. And if you remember, just like we did out here, we were able to do 2 name value pairs. Let's go ahead and see if we can provide those name value pairs here. So we had first, which was 4, and then we had second was 5, and then if we go ahead and run this, we should get the result 9. And in fact, we do. That's the HTTP response. Our Azure Functions /API is functioning properly, but there's one configuration we have to do to work from local up to Azure, which is CORS, right? That's that cross-domain capability. We have to make sure that we have that configured correctly. But once again, if we go back out here, it's I went one too far, sorry. If we go down to, no, that's the storage account. You want to scroll down, and there's a lot of stuff here, but if you scroll down to the API capabilities, there is CORS, okay? If you look at that function that we had over here working with the ability to fire off, the ability to do the Excel add-on, that service is running on port 3000 of localhost. So if we want this to be able to talk cross-domain from our local machine up to Azure, we have to add this as a place that that it will accept requests from. So let's go back out to this and let's add that. So we want to go HTTPS localhost, and it should work if you do it with or without the port. Let's see, let's add port 3000 just to make it specific. If you don't add the HTTPS, it will not accept it and you won't get a check mark there. So that means that everything's good. The other thing I did earlier today that slowed me down a little bit is, yes, you hit enter, but you got to hit save. It doesn't save until you click save. So this is an allowable place now for our secondary function to work. So now we're going to call a local function hosted local to a remote function hosted in Azure to then work on our Excel local as well. Okay, so that's kind of a scenario that we're doing. So think about a scenario where you have these functions up in Azure and you have a bunch of local Excel files that work on all sorts of, once again, financial modeling and data analytics, and maybe gets information from line of business applications that are hosted also in Azure. I think you can extrapolate the different use cases there. So that looks like it's saved. Let me just go out to the overview, because I want to see that this function is getting executed, and you can start to see some telemetry already coming in. So let's go ahead and reduce that. In the code, what you have to do is simply, of course, change the URL of where this thing is going to post to and from. So instead of working local to post the addition, we want it to work in our production environment, which is up in Azure. So let's go ahead and hit Control S. Once again, if we were to go out to our, I guess I closed that, so This would have sucked it up on the fly. I was going to show you that, but let's just go ahead and stop this and let's do a npm build. Okay, let's see. Okay, sorry that this is buried here, but what we want to do is we want to do a build, npm run build, which will rebuild this package. Okay, everything's built, life looks good, and then if we go ahead and do a start, it then fires off our node tracer and fires off Excel. And let me just bump up the properties a little bit here. Well, that might have been a little too much. But you can see how it built the package and got everything running, and life is good there. And then if we're out here in Excel, let's see if we can get this to work. And it's busy, just like it is locally. I'm really hoping that that request went through. So here's the process flow. So our add-in is picking up this custom function, coming down through our add function that we have off of this, building up the request, sending it off, getting the results back, right? And there's a promise here to get the results, and then we go ahead and display the results, or we display an error message. And then let's go over to Azure at least and see if we're getting some telemetry showing up there, at least on the request. I would have expected for another request to come up here as well, but I'm not seeing it. So I think what I'm going to do the next time I do this, I'm not going to work local. I'm going to remote into a VM on Azure so that my network bandwidth is not coming into play here. But I wanted to impress you with having it work on my local machine. All right, so we've got about 10 minutes left. I want to go ahead and just open this up to Q&A if there's any questions. I know this was a lot. I was trying to show you a lot of this as quickly as possible. The repos are going to be available, and as well as the links. So if you want to go ahead and recreate any of this on your own, you too can build your dev environment, all of the prereqs, get the extensions installed in Visual Studio Code. And the great thing about this is it's free. You can recreate this and play with this for free because you can get a free subscription of Azure. Visual Studio Code is free, and of course you can get all of this stuff from GitHub repos as well. I guess I gotta change the settings to do not disturb. How was the session for everybody? Okay, thank you, Michelle. Yes, you can work with Node.js, which is what we're doing here, but you could do Python, you could do C# as well. I'm just going to tell you that pretty much the way all of the source, the source code that I'm going to supply in the deck, if you want to grab it, is going to primarily show that If you're doing data analytics and machine learning and AI, that's all going to be the Python stack. I would encourage you to use the Python language for those. But if you're doing normal kind of UI-ish type stuff, JavaScript would be the way to go. Yeah, so what I really want to try to do is if there's not a lot of questions, I'm really trying to plow and blaze a trail of creating design patterns with the rest of the community leaders, and really trying to create reference architectures of what language with what function using what bits for common scenarios that I'm seeing for my enterprise clients. And then obviously provide that out in GitHub, so that what you can do is, instead of starting from scratch, you'd be able to just do a git pull of a specific reference architecture, and then now you can just stay focused on your implementation and then go ahead and deploy it. And a key piece to this too is you can work local. When you're developing these Azure functions, you could work local if, let's say, you don't have an Azure subscription, or you're concerned that you're going to incur costs up in Azure. You can do all of this local, and then when you have a client or a sandbox somewhere that your company is allowing you to work with, and they're picking up the Azure bill, then you can start to deploy your Azure functions in those types of POC or dev environments. Let's just give the Excel. I was really hoping that would work, but what does work is the Contoso increment, and we can increment by increments of 10. We can do increments of 1. We can do increments of 100. Okay, well, either I did a good job, or you guys are really, really smart and you already know this, which I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever. Okay, so let's just get back to this right here. And let's go back to let's see if we got that. All right, we did questions. I just wanted to also just thank all of the sponsors that helped to put this together, and don't forget about the raffle. We're giving away some stuff, so make sure you participate in that. Submit all your answers, and make sure that you just give feedback, good, bad, or indifferent. I need the feedback. It helps me get better at what I do. At the end of the day, I'm here to provide as much value as possible, and I really just want to leave you better off than how I found you. And so if you feel as though I helped you be a little bit of a better solution design, and added some weapons to your tool belt, then that would be great. So here's some information here for the event feedback, as well as speaking.